Here is a turquoise ink by Sailor Bungubox Hatsuyume Aofuji.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Turquoise doesn't tend to be among my favorites of colors, but this is a very blue leaning, making it a light blue range that I've been enjoying lately. A quick note, the wet fine is discolored because of a cleaning issue on my part, so I'm going to show it for just a couple of seconds, just for the purpose of it being there, but I'm not going to do any commentary on it. As for when I don't screw up the cleaning, the tone has only slight variation by nib and flow, but none are bad in and of themselves. Good Lord. This is frequent and pleasantly shading as an ink. I tend to prefer inks that are darker on the page, and this, it isn't for me, but it's still a great ink.
The pen for today is a Pilot Vanishing Point. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a nice lighter blue turquoise, really turquoise that's leaning very blue. We get no feathering, we get no spread. None of that is a surprise. And when we look at surprise for shading, you see the S is a little darker. It lightens up at the U into the R. Where it gets darker through that into the P, lightens up out of that all the way to the end of the S and E at the end of the word, where it gets very dark. I'm just showing the wet fine for the color. Looking at the medium nib, it is a slight bit darker than it was with the soft fine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We have a very nice tone on the page, still very much being a turquoise with a blue lean. Now, as far as the goblins of shading, you see it in goblins on the second line. The top of the G is much lighter than the bottom of the G, and during the O, it goes from a dark to a lighter tone, and then darkens up quite a bit on the BLI, lightening on the N, dark on the S again. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, same tone as it was with the soft fine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. When it comes to the shading, we definitely get to see some of the darker areas of this. Taking a look at Eagles, you see it starts very, very light at the top of the E and the A, but the bottom of that E, much darker. Top of the G is light. Bottom of the G is dark, lightens up, gets very dark at the S. Looking at dark also on the second line, it goes gradually, very nicely from very light to very dark at the last leg of the K. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There were approximately 11 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get far and away very nice shading. Looking at far away on the first line, far is very dark compared to away, which is a much lighter word, until you get to the Y. Right at the Y, it darkens up quite a bit. And when you look directly underneath that at Tor, incredibly dark, and at shades from a light A to a dark T. I'm just showing this wet fine for the color. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. Always such a joy with this paper. The shading is nowhere nearly left out. Look at nearly left on the second line. You see nearly goes light on the N, dark at the A, goes to a mid-tone on the ARL, but very dark at the Y, where left, mostly a mid-tone until you get to the T that gets much darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, same tone as the soft fine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. As far as shading, almost none has been born on this page. Look at born on the second line. Think that's some of where you get to see it a little bit better. It is there. We get very lighter, or we get lighter tones and much darker tones. Looking at born, it's a nice mid-tone B. ORN is pretty light, but during the N and into the E, it darkens up a whole lot. It's not the last spot that has shading. Lots of them do. Look at last on the third line. Really shades from a mid-tone to dark at the T. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it's as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but this is one of the reasons that I really lean to this being a turquoise that has a blue lean, because on this paper, it's definitely a turquoise that has a green lean. No feathering, no spread. That color swinging does show some of the shading. Looking at swinging in the second line. The bottom of the S is a bit darker than the rest of the S, and during the W, it transitions out of a darker tone into a lighter tone until you get to the first G, where it really starts to darken up and get much darker through the end of the word. Looking at the wet fine nib, I'm only showing this for the color. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker a tone than on the Clairfontaine, really showing off a beautiful green turquoise on this paper. The paper having the effect that really does alter it, showing that either it's the paper affecting the ink itself, or what I really think is that it's a much more translucent ink. No feather, no spread. The shading that goes on, some of it is quite suddenly dark or not. Look at suddenly on the second line. The entire word is very dark the whole way through, which is mostly what we get. But sometimes we do get some nicer tones, like on above, that starts lighter, gets dark at the B, lightens up at the O, dark at the VE. Same kind of behavior happens with trees on the first line. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, little bit lighter than it was with the soft fine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We do not escape any of the shading. Looking at escape on the second line, you see that it starts much lighter, but at the P it darkens up a little bit, lightens up coming out until we get to the D. Shading just in time. Looking at those words, just in time on the third line, just starts light, transitions dark, slowly all the way into the T. Same thing happens with in, light to dark, time, light to dark, except where the T crosses it again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. And something really worth pointing out here, because it's kind of where it stops happening, but the first word each time has always been a bit darker than the rest of the writing, meaning that as this ink sits in the pen, even for a few seconds, it does tend to give some of that darker tone, like on the word faint. Now, no feathering, no spread, shading just as nice as it was on the Clairfontaine. Looking at floor, that the F is darker, it lightens up out of the F into the L where it gets dark again. Nice mid-tone on the second O, very dark on the R. Looking at the wet fine nib, we're not commenting on it, we're just looking at the color. I think it's giving a nice color. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, shading that can leave you feeling a little giddy at times, like giddy on the third line. The G starts lighter, the I gets a bit darker, but the DDY gets very dark. And this is a darker word in the center, where if you look at heights on the second line, it starts as a darker midtone at the H, lightens up at the E, darkens up at the GH, and very dark at the TS. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium nib. The same tone as the soft fine. The same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We do get this ink climbing the ladder of shading. Now, ladders on the third line doesn't really show it off as much, which is why I wanted to look at that word. The shading that goes on is fairly gentle. The top of the L is light. The bottom is a midtone into the A. Light out of the A into the first D that's much darker. Second D lightening up a little bit. Nice midtone through the rest of the word. Something I liked a whole lot. Looking at light right next to it, that starts light, works its way very dark at the K, lightens up out of the K, very dark at the D. Looking at the back of the page, not a surprise that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Three Oysters, Grayoul Hanoil.
Here is Diamine Aqua Lagoon. Here is Private Reserve Blue Suede.
Here is Van Diemen's Freyanet Aquamarine.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really not usable to me here. Not that I can't read it, but those vertical lines really are very distracting. It is not dark enough to really deal with. Not for a student note taker. No, thank you. Though it has no feathering and it has no spread, and you do not have to imagine that it has shading. It does. Look at Imagine on the second line. The IM is darker than the AGI, yet the NE at the end darken up a bit. Between on the third line is mostly a lighter tone until you get to the end, where the on the fourth line, very dark. Looking at the wet fine nib, we're just showing it to look at the color, which is not especially good here. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Really, a tad bit, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We are getting some shading, but it's not something that's sticking out a whole lot. Let's look at sticking on the second line, where it starts as a midtone, gets darker at the T, lightens up through most of the word as a lighter midtone until the N and G at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, about the same tone as the soft fine, quite a bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. Shading in this case is something that is best imagined. Now it is present, but it is not huge amount. Look at imagined on the second line. Midtone at the I, very light at the M, midtone again at the AG, but lightening up at the IN, midtone again at the ED. Since really what we're getting is midtones and light tones here, shading is not something that's especially stand out. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, but I still would not recommend this for a student.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Platinum Pink. Here is an orange ink by Diamine Coral. Here is a magenta ink by Noodler's Cuprin. Here is a yellow ink by Robert Oster Honeybee. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It's shading really well. It's got this paper bent over, grabbing its ankles. Look at ankles. I had to really stretch for that one. Look at ankles on the third line. The beginning of the A is darker, but the AN is a midtone. The KLE is darker, lightens up out of the E into a very dark S. Once again, I'm just showing this wet fine for the color. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine nib. Little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now we get the tiniest bit of feathering and we get almost nothing for spread, so it's doing very well here. The shading that's going on is just lightly in the shadows, looking at shadows on the third line. The S is a midtone where the H gets darker, midtone through the rest of the word, and that's about what you're going to get for shading here. One letter that may be just a little bit darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, tiny bit darker than it was with the soft fine, certainly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, we get some feathering and we get some spread. Neither of them do I see as a big deal that would stop you from using this ink on the page. The shading that goes on, this is Dreadful paper, so we don't tend to expect a lot of shading. And look at Dreadful on the third line. You only see a couple of moments like the top of the D or the top of the R, bottom of the E, that are a little bit darker. For the most part, it's a very light tone and not something I would really recommend. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the broad you might be able to write back there. Same with the soft fine. As far as the wet fine and the medium, I don't think you could write back here or you risk losing your notes, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry soft fine has an easily readable tone and shades very well. The medium flow medium looks the same except for line width. The medium flow broad is lighter and shades well, but just isn't for me. I really think a wet medium would give it just a tad bit darker and still deliver very good shading. Though from a wet pen, it does have the potential to lose a bit of that turquoise look and look more blue.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you're not subscribed, I would invite you to do so now.